In the future, it's possible that nowhere will be safe. Franco Mantovani lives in the Po Valley in Italy. 16 million live here, a third of the country's population. All of them are at risk. The danger is flooding, and the threat is from the River Po.
This is the Po River. Actually, the level is very low because we are in a dry season, but you have to think that during the rain season, the level can reach this, where we are now. On the opposite side of the Po River, you see the small village of Poleselle. As you can see, the topography is very different. The level of the Po River is higher, something like 5-10 meters of the village. And that is a very high risk, especially when we have a lot of precipitation.
50 years from now, the Po will regularly overflow its banks onto the helpless towns and villages 10 meters below. The problem is the sea. Sea levels around the world have risen 2.5 millimeters in the last 50 years. By 2050, they will be up to 50 centimeters higher. Any river, the Po included, flows down to the sea. So if sea levels go up, the river has nowhere to go. It has to flood.
Floods across much of Southeast Asia today. The Yellow River has all but vanished over the last 18 years, but today, what's left of it burst its banks. An estimated 15 million are homeless, and Gaiju city is already underwater. More rain is forecast, and several other cities are already under threat. On top of the floods themselves, disease, toxic waste spills and malnutrition are expected to be the major problems. Forecasts put the death toll at the floods at 800,000 minimum, and experts are warning that the situation could get worse.
It's easy to imagine that this vision of our future is nothing but fantasy. Could something as inconvenient as the weather really do so much harm? Look around the world we live in today. Recently, there have been massive floods in Europe. You can't blame any single flood on global warming, but when freak weather stretches across most of a continent, you can begin to detect the first hints of climate change. Global warming offers the terrifying prospect that this kind of damage may become not a freak, but a normal part of every year.
This is just the tip of the iceberg. We've seen temperatures rise by 0.6 of a degree Celsius in the last 100 years. It's predicted, at worst, to increase by another 6 degrees by the end of this century. Now, that's incredible. If we're already starting to see these more extreme events happening now with that tiny rise, what the heck are we going to see in 100 years' time?
Coastal cities everywhere will be in danger. But it's not just cities. Research suggests that in the future, nowhere will be safe. In the mountains, global warming will pose a very different danger, but one that is just as deadly. These are the Italian Dolomites, famous for their scenery and tranquility. It's another kind of paradise, but even here, things are not always as they appear. As the scars on this mountainside reveal.
That's Tessina landslide, a huge landslide, 7 million of cubic meters of material, marsh and clay, with a high content of water that create a very high speed of movement. The movement that we can measure is between 30 and 40 meters per day. The risk for the villages is very high because the landslide is continuously moving.
This particular landslide was filmed in China, but the same thing can happen on mountains all across the world, and often does. In the Dolomites, when it rains heavily, the land turns into soft, slippery mud. Whole mountainsides of earth lose their grip on the rock underneath them and slide. All this mud was once part of the hillside above it. It flowed down the valley like a river, stopping just short of the village of Funès. The mud here is over 100 meters deep, and the threat returns every time it rains.
Maybe it will fall down, and this could be a very high risk for the population. We hope no.
Well, mountains are what are known as sensitive terrains. The slightest change in climate or in weather, and they can be very severely affected. Now, what we can expect in the future as mountainous terrain starts to warm up and permafrost starts to melt is that you will start to see the formation of gigantic landslides. Some of these things can consist of tens of millions of tons of rock, and they can bury an entire town. They can travel at velocities of as rapid as a hurricane, for example, and obliterate whole towns. So people living in valleys, in high mountainous terrains, they can start to worry. I think they should start to worry in the future about these big landslide events.
The signs of danger are everywhere. Just a kilometer down from the Tessina landslide, the town of Lamosano has problems of its own. The town has been here for hundreds of years, but we now know that beneath it lies a fault in the rock. In recent times, the whole village has begun cracking apart. The road surface now has to be entirely remade every year. And a few years ago, the arches in these two walls were perfectly aligned. In Lamosano, the threat is not a mudslide from above. It's that the fault beneath them will give way. Global warming will bring more rain. Water will seep into the fault, lubricating the rock, encouraging it to slide. If the fault does give way, Lamosano will be turned to rubble in seconds. For anyone caught here, death would be certain.
The people here, they know that maybe a landslide can occur and can destroy the houses, but they stay here. They doesn't want to leave the area. They want to stay here. If you live in the mountain, you know that you have some type of risk, but you stay in the area. You cannot leave the mountain. It's difficult to explain, but the people on the mountain are like the trees on the slope. So you have the slope, you have trees on the slope, and you have the man. The man has to stay in this type of natural area, and he cannot leave the mountain. He has to stay there.
Even if the people here did choose to abandon the mountains, they might find that there was nowhere else to go. In the mountains, science predicts landslides. In the valleys, floods. What will happen to us when disasters are striking all the time and everywhere? To us, it may seem a remote prospect. To some, it's already a reality.
We need to get them higher ground. We need to get them some tents or some temporary shelter. We also need to get some food and supplies for them, and some means to cook and things. Because, you know, Their place was destroyed last time, and we don't want that to happen to them again.
Disasters are becoming more complex. If you have an earthquake in the middle of a bad El Nino, then you have avalanches in the high country. You have rock slides, mudslides, landslides, collapsed buildings, floods, flash floods, all the water-related diseases, contamination problems. You have one disaster or two disasters which cause a chain reaction where, depending on where you are, you can be affected by 5 or 6 different disasters. From my perspective, and I've worked at more than 100 major disasters in the world, things are just continuing to get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse.
What Peru suffers during an El Nino year is what Doug Kopp believes we will all suffer in the future. A life where just coping with disaster consumes everything. In his vision of the future, anything beyond basic survival would be a luxury beyond price.
These El Ninos are becoming more and more severe and more frequent as our climate is changing and our planet is convulsing from being so set upon. Initially, people are killed when the El Nino comes in. They're killed, and then you have flash floods on top of floods, and more people are killed. You have landslides and mudslides, and people are killed from that. And massive destruction continues and continues and continues. They're beaten down into the dirt, and then they come out and they try to, overcome their psychological problems and their absolute depression, and then they try to start over, and they half get going, and then they're beaten down in the dirt again. How many times can you be beaten down and put in such a miserable state before it affects you mentally that you just start not caring? You stop caring, and you don't paint your house anymore. What's the sense in painting your house? Because it's only going to be destroyed. What's the sense in putting half a wall back up again? Because it's only going to be destroyed. And not only do you have to have the work involved in the repair, but you also have to have the money and spend the money that you could spend on food or something else to repair your house. It's only going to be destroyed again.
This is the future which scientists predict awaits us all. And beyond the immediate horror of human suffering lies another shocking question. Who is going to pay?